3 generations of that family worked land that one signature should have taken from them. The porch had been there longer than Earl Sutton could remember, which was saying something, because Earl Sutton was 79 years old and remembered nearly everything. He remembered the smell of his mother's cornbread cooling on the windowsill in July. He remembered the exact pitch of his father's voice when the man sang hymns before sunrise, low and off-key and somehow still beautiful. He remembered the first frost of 1971, how it came 2 weeks early and killed half their tobacco before they could get it to the barn, and how his father stood at the edge of the field with his hat pressed to his chest like he was attending a funeral. He remembered all of it, but the thing he held in his hands right now, the thing he turned over slowly between his thick, weathered fingers every evening when the sun began its descent behind the tree line, that was the thing he remembered most of all. More than the cornbread, more than the hymns, more than the frost. A single piece of paper, folded in thirds, soft at the creases from decades of handling, the ink slightly brown now where once it had been black, the edges worn to a velvet smoothness that only time and repeated human touch could produce. He kept it in a tin box on the mantle above the fireplace, inside a plastic sleeve his granddaughter Della had bought him at the office supply store in town 3 years ago. Before the sleeve, he had kept it wrapped in wax paper. Before the wax paper, folded inside his father's Bible, pressed between the pages of Psalms. It was more valuable than the rifle that hung above the mantel beside it, more valuable than the deed to the house, which was stored in the bank lockbox in Claremont, more valuable than anything else in the 4 rooms of that farmhouse, including the farmhouse itself. It was a letter, 1 page, handwritten, signed at the bottom by a man named Charles Aldridge Webb, county attorney, dated September 14th, 1953. Earl set the paper in his lap and looked out over the land. 42 acres. It did not sound like much to people who had never worked it. To them, 42 acres was a number, an abstraction, something you might read in a real estate listing between the price and the square footage of the house. To those people, 42 acres might as well have been 42 anything, $42, 42 miles, 42 years. But to the Sutton family, 42 acres was the entire world. It was the creek that ran along the eastern border, cold enough in summer to make your teeth ache, where Earl had caught his first catfish at age 6, with a cane pole his grandfather Elias had cut from the grove behind the barn. It was the south field, where the soil went dark and deep and grew things almost willingly, where 3 generations of Suttons had planted tobacco and corn and soybeans, and once, memorably, a failed experiment in watermelons that his father never quite lived down. It was the hill at the property's northwest corner where the old cemetery sat, 3 modest stones in a row, Elias, his wife Corinthia, and a child who had not survived his first winter, surrounded by a low iron fence that Earl repainted every spring, whether it needed it or not. It was the barn that leaned slightly to the left, had always leaned slightly to the left, would probably continue leaning slightly to the left until it decided finally to give up and fall, which Earl privately believed it would outlast him in resisting. It was the walnut tree his father had planted the year he came back from Korea, now 60 feet tall and wide enough that Earl could not get his arms halfway around its trunk. It was the porch itself, the boards replaced 3 times, but the frame the original, where Earl had sat through 10,000 evenings, and where his father had sat before him, and where his grandfather had sat before that. 42 acres was a life, was 3 lives, was everything that word was supposed to mean when you said it slowly and meant it. Elias Sutton had bought the land in 1919 with money he had saved for 11 years, working first as a farmhand for a white man named Garrett in the next county, then as a laborer at the mill in town, then gradually, carefully, as a man who kept every dollar he earned that did not go toward keeping himself alive. He had a plan, and the plan required patience, and Elias Sutton had patience in a quantity that people who knew him described, with a mixture of admiration and something approaching awe, as almost supernatural. He was 31 years old when he walked into the office of a land broker named Harrison and placed cash money on the desk and bought 42 acres of Piedmont land that had been sitting idle for 4 years following the death of the previous owner's son. The broker, by most accounts, had not been pleased. The transaction had not been smooth. There had been, over the following weeks, certain pressures applied from certain quarters of the community, suggestions made, visits paid. But Elias had anticipated this. He had done something that in 1919, for a black man in that county, required both foresight and a particular quality of courage that is different from the dramatic kind. Quieter, more sustained, and in many ways more difficult. He had gotten it in writing. Not just the deed, which he knew could be contested and was contested twice in the years that followed, but letters, affidavits, a signed statement from the broker himself, obtained before the community pressure had fully materialized, confirming the terms of the sale, the amount paid, and the date of transfer. He had filed copies with the county recorder's office, with a lawyer in a city 2 hours away, and with the local branch of the NAACP. He had understood something that many men in his position, worn down by the daily mathematics of survival, did not always have the energy to understand. That in a world where your word counted for less than another man's, your paper had to count for more. Earl's father, James Sutton, had been 17 when Elias died in 1948. He inherited the land, a modest debt at the grain cooperative, a reputation in the county as a serious and capable farmer, and his father's habit of documentation. James kept records the way other men kept faith. Every transaction, every agreement, every handshake arrangement that might someday need to be remembered. He wrote it down, had it signed where he could get a signature, kept copies in 2 places. People sometimes teased him about it, gently, the way you tease someone about a habit that is more admirable than ridiculous. James did not mind the teasing. James had grown up watching his father navigate a world that kept its agreements selectively, and knew that paper, properly maintained, had a memory that men did not always choose to have. In 1953, a man named Delbert Crane came to see James Sutton. Crane was a developer, connected to a larger interest in Charlotte, and he wanted the land. He did not want to buy it. What he wanted, though he presented it in language that required several minutes of polite unwrapping to understand, was for James to sign over development rights and what he called a participation agreement that would have, in the fine print that he did not particularly emphasize, transferred effective control of the property to his company for a period of 99 years, in exchange for what amounted to a small annual payment and a series of promises that had no enforcement mechanism James could identify. James said he would think about it. He took the papers. He drove 2 hours to the lawyer in the city, the same firm his father had used, and had the documents reviewed. The lawyer had been direct. "Sign this," he told James, "and your family will be tenants on your own land within 5 years, legally, completely, with no practical recourse." James came home and wrote a letter to Charles Aldridge Webb, the county attorney, with whom he had a formal but functional relationship built on years of James doing everything by the book, and Webb acknowledging, in his careful official way, that James Sutton was a man of his word. The letter laid out what had happened. It asked for nothing except an acknowledgement that the county attorney's office was aware of the situation, which, in that specific legal context, at that specific historical moment, was a way of saying that if something happened to that land, there would be a record of why. Webb wrote back on September 14, 1953. 1 page. He confirmed receipt of James's letter. He confirmed that the records of the Sutton property were in good order with the county. He confirmed that any future claims against the property would be subject to the full review of his office. And then, in the final paragraph, in language that was formal but unmistakably personal, he wrote that the Sutton family had been a part of this county for 34 years, that the property had been legally and properly acquired and maintained, and that it was his professional opinion, offered in his official capacity, that the family's claim to that land was without legitimate challenge. Delbert Crane came back once more, 3 months later, with a revised offer. James showed him the letter. Crane left and did not return. The third time the paper saved the land, Earl was 44 years old, and his father had been dead for 2 years. It was 1991, and the county was doing something with road assessments and eminent domain that the newspapers in Charlotte wrote about, but that people in the rural parts of the county mostly found out about when someone knocked on their door. They were widening a state route, and the proposed path of the widening would take, according to the preliminary survey, approximately 6 acres from the eastern border of the Sutton property, including the creek. The compensation offered was a number that bore no relationship to the actual value of the land, or, more importantly, to the actual value of the creek, which fed the property's irrigation and had been doing so for 70 years. The survey itself contained an error, a small one, but meaningful, regarding the placement of the original property boundary. Earl had gone through his father's papers over the months following James's death, organizing and cataloguing with a thoroughness that surprised even himself, because he had not known until he was doing it how much it would feel like a conversation with his father. A long, quiet, one-sided conversation conducted through receipts and letters and careful handwritten notes in the margins of legal documents. He had found the web letter in its wax paper, read it, and placed it in the tin box on the mantle, which is where his father had kept it but never explained why. When the road assessment arrived, Earl's neighbour in the next farm, a man named Gruber, told him to take what they offered and be glad. That the county had decided what it had decided, and that was the practical end of it. Earl drove 2 hours to the city. Different firm, same philosophy. The lawyer, a woman named Mattingly who reminded him in some way he couldn't name of his grandmother, reviewed the survey, identified the boundary error, and noted that the original deed, supplemented by the web letter and the chain of associated county records, established the eastern boundary clearly and in a way that contradicted the preliminary survey. The state route was adjusted. The 6 acres stayed. The creek stayed. Mattingly had billed him fairly and sent him a note afterward that said simply, "Your grandfather knew what he was doing." Earl had kept that note too. The sun was below the tree line now. The 42 acres had gone to that particular shade of late evening green that existed for only about 20 minutes each day, saturated and deep, before the light thinned out and everything went to grey and blue. Earl had watched this transition for so many evenings that he felt he knew it the way you know a person, its rhythms, its variations by season, the way it came earlier in winter and later in summer, and was different somehow, richer in the weeks after rain. He heard the screen door open behind him. His granddaughter Della, 31 years old, a veterinarian with a practice in the county seat, who still came home every Sunday and had come to stay for 2 weeks while her husband was travelling for work, sat down in the chair beside him with 2 glasses of sweet tea and set one on the porch rail within his reach. She looked at the paper in his lap and said nothing for a while. She had grown up knowing about the paper. It had been explained to her when she was young, re-explained when she was older, and could understand the layers of it. And somewhere along the way, it had become for her the same thing it had always been for Earl. Not just a document, but a kind of proof. Proof that care, applied steadily over time, accumulated into something real. "You should let me make a proper copy," she said. "Archival quality. I looked it up. There are services." "You mentioned that." "I mention it because it's a good idea. I've got the plastic sleeve." "The plastic sleeve is not archival quality, Grandpa." Earl smiled without turning from the field. "It's held this long." Della sipped her tea. A whippoorwill started up somewhere in the tree line, its call carrying clean in the cooling air. "Tell me the web part again," she said. Not because she didn't know it, because she wanted to hear him tell it. Earl looked down at the paper. He did not unfold it. He knew it by heart. Every word of it, had known it for 40 years. He could recite it forward and backward, in the middle of the night, could hear it in his father's voice reading it aloud at the kitchen table when Earl was a boy, the way James had read it, the way other men read scripture, not to extract new meaning, but to reaffirm what was already understood. He wrote, Earl said, that the family's claim to that land was without legitimate challenge. He paused. "That's the part. That's the sentence." Della nodded slowly. "A white county attorney in 1953, Earl said. writing that, signing his name to it. You understand what that cost him politically, even if it cost him nothing practically, the statement itself. I understand. Your great-grandfather understood too. That's why he kept it. Earl's thumb moved slowly across the edge of the paper, that velvet border worn smooth by 1,000 such gestures. He didn't keep it because he was angry. He kept it because he was grateful, because he knew it was rare, and that rare things need to be maintained. The whippoorwill called again. The green of the field had gone to grey now, right on schedule. What do you want to do with it? Della asked. When? She did not finish the sentence and did not need to. Earl was quiet for a moment. It goes to you, he said. Same as it came to me. You keep it in the box. You show it to your children when they're old enough, and you tell them the whole thing from the beginning, from Elias walking into that broker's office with his money counted out. And you tell them why we kept it. Not just what it is. Why? Because a man's legacy is written in ink that didn't fade. Earl turned to look at her. Your father tell you that? You did, she said. About 10 years ago. You probably don't remember. He probably didn't. He was 79 and remembered nearly everything, but the things he said himself had a way of slipping past him, the way familiar music does. You know every note, but could not tell someone when exactly you learned it. It's true, though, he said, turning back to the field. The first stars were coming out. Not many yet, just the early, confident ones that appeared handed forward, intact. The ink that didn't fade. Not because ink was permanent, but because someone had taken care. Earl Sutton sat on his porch in the dark, the paper beside him, the land around him, and was at peace. The box is still on the mantle. The letter is still in it.